Hello and a very good morning. You're watching Rajya Sabha TV. I'm Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, the two-day 80th All India Presiding Officers Conference aiming to facilitate a dialogue between presiding officers of the Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha and other legislative bodies will begin in a short while from now near the Statue of Unity at Kevadia in Gujarat's Narmada district. The event, also known as the Speakers Conference, will be inaugurated by President Ramnath Kovind. Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla is the chairperson of the conference, which began in 1921 and is in its centenary year now. The conference is being organized on the theme Harmonious Coordination between Legislature, Executive and Judiciary, Key to a Vibrant Democracy. Vice President and Rajya Sabha Chairman Venkaiah Naidu will also attend the conference along with dignitaries like Governors of Gujarat and Rajasthan and the Gujarat Chief Minister Vijay Rupani. Congress leader in the Lok Sabha, Adhir Ranjan Chaudhary, Union Parliamentary Affairs Minister Prahlad Joshi and presiding officers of various legislative bodies from across the country will also participate. During the conclusion of the conference on the Constitution Day on Thursday, delegates will recite the preamble to the Constitution under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who will also address the concluding session. In this special telecast today, we will bring you a preview of the Speakers Conference. Joining me on the program right now are Chakshu Roy, Head of Outreach, PRS Legislative Research, and VK Agnihotri, former Secretary General, Rajya Sabha. Thank you to the both of you joining me early this morning. Mr. Agnihotri, let me begin with you first. Let's talk about the conference and, understand, what is the significance of the presiding officers of the conference of presiding officers of legislative bodies.
Well, there are two main themes which have dominated the presiding officers conference in the past. One is that there should be some coordination and some uniformity in the procedures of the legislative assemblies and the parliament, and of course legislative council. The second theme is the current issues which are bothering the presiding officers, and they are requested every year to suggest the topics, and based on their concerns, then a few of them are picked up for detailed discussion and for coming to some conclusion for the guidance of all the participants of the conference. So, for instance, very often the issue is how to control the House, how to make the disruptions, eliminate disruptions in the House. This has recurred over the years. Another one is how to make the participation of the members more effective in the proceedings of the parliamentary and legislative bodies. So that is how these conferences have been organized in the past.
Okay, Chakshu Roy, let's talk about the history of the conference. How has it evolved over the years? Why was it formed initially?
Frank, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that this is the 100th year of the conference, and the first conference was held under the chairmanship of the President of the Central Legislative Assembly, Mr. White. Now, it is interesting, over the last 100 years, the conference has, evolved, it has taken different shapes. So, the conference venue today for me has a lot of symbolism. It is being held in Gujarat, and the first elected president of the Central Legislative Assembly was Mr. Vittalbhai Patel. And one of the things that Mr. Patel did when he chaired the first, as an elected speaker, when he chaired the first conference in 1926, in that conference, a motion was moved for an independent secretariat for the Central Legislative Assembly. Then, over the years, as Agnihotri ji was pointing out, that there have been dominant themes for the conference. In the pre-independence years, the theme was more about legislative procedures. But we also have to remember that in the pre-independence period, the legislatures were not fully representative. So, there was a lot of executive strength within the legislatures. There was also a sense that the legislators were not truly representative of the country. So the kind of issues that were discussed there were only germane to the institution of the legislature itself, and the institution was evolving after the 1919 Act. Now, a couple of other different things have happened. So, for example, the conference used to be held only in Delhi and Shimla. Shimla used to be the summer capital, Delhi was the capital. So, till pre-independence, conference used to be held in these two venues. Independence onwards, our first speaker, Sri Mavlankar, suggested that it might be a good idea to hold the conference annually so that presiding officers from across the country can get together, exchange views, as Mr. Agnihotri was saying, discuss common issues that they're facing in terms of running of their institutions, and what are the solutions that could be evolved. So the venue of the conference shifted. It shifted from New Delhi and Shimla, and it started going all across the country. The idea was it would give a sense of unity. The idea was it would also allow presiding officers to understand different parts of the country. So the first one outside of Delhi in 1951 was in Trivandrum, a city, Frank, that you might be very familiar with. There onwards, Gujarat, I think, has hosted the conference on 4 or 5 different occasions. Once it was hosted, I think, in 1953 in Rajkot, thrice in Gandhinagar, and now, at Kevadia, as you pointed out. Post-independence, the conference again evolved. Not only did it become a forum for discussing legislative issues, its mandate became a little more wider, right from its very inception, in the post-independence period. The conference also started discussing other national issues. It started discussing, so for example, during the India-China war, how do you ensure that the legislatures are able to protect the rights of citizens while discussing, important issues, was an issue that was taken up. Thereafter, another change happened. And one of those changes was that after the 1985 amendment to the Constitution, the role of presiding officers also expanded a little bit, because they were now responsible under the 10th schedule on deciding on defection proceedings. So the conference also took up that particular topic. So as you see, the trajectory of the conference, has been quite wide and varied. Its name changed. It was the President's Conference earlier, then it became the Elected President's Conference, then to include everybody, it started being called the Presiding Officers Conference.
Right.
And finally, let me just conclude there. Not only has the conference evolved, a lot of the findings from the conference have now resulted in procedural changes in our legislatures across the country.
Absolutely. Right. So, Mr. Agnihotri, before we talk about the 80th conference itself and what to expect really as far as the 2-day conference which is about to begin in a short while from now, let's also talk about the aims, objectives and the scope of the conference itself.
Well, as I already mentioned, it is a forum for the presiding officers of the legislative and parliamentary bodies to come together and discuss common issues which are of concern to them at the given point of time. As Mr. Chakshurai mentioned, it is largely the procedures and practices. But if there are some urgent national issues, that also they come and discuss during these conferences. And that is how, from time to time, the theme of the conference also changes. This time, of course, it is a very broad theme, and that is the relationship between the 3 pillars of democracy and how to harmonize this relationship. Because in the past, there have been several occasions when one of the 3 pillars has tried to dominate the others. And if you take the analogy of a chair, if a chair has three legs, and then if one leg is taller than the other two or is smaller than the other two or otherwise, then the balance is not there. So, to maintain the constitutional balance, it is very important that the three pillars of democracy act in harmony and in the spirit of the constitutional provisions.
Absolutely. All right, Chakshu, I'll just come to this year's theme, and we'll talk about that elaborately in just a bit. Let's also talk about some of the, significant landmarks as far as the conference is concerned over the years.
Frank, over the years, not only has the conference itself added to legislative functioning and legislative changes, in our institutions, both at Parliament and at the state Vidhan Sabha level. There have been a couple of outcomes, which are quite laudable. So, for example, after the presiding officers conference, flowing from it, there is also a conference of secretary generals. Then, there is also a conference of whips from across the country. Now, these are also two extremely important conferences that have started coming out after the start of the presiding officers conferences. Then, it's not as if that the presiding officers conference is an annual affair. There are occasions on which emergency sessions of the presiding officers have been called. Agnihotri ji would remember that in 2005, Honorable Speaker Somnath Chatterjee had called an emergency meeting of the presiding officers because, and that meeting was called because there was an impression that there was some judicial interference in the work of the legislature because certain summons were issued to Parliament. Now, and that was not the only emergency conference that was called. I think in the conference's 100-year history, I think there have been 4 or 5 occasions when such emergency conferences. Then, the conference has also kept up with times. So, for example, in one of the presiding officers' conferences, one of the things that was decided upon was how do you make the working of Vidhan Sabhas more technological? How do you ensure? So, the e-Vidhan Sabha project was something that was highlighted recently. How do you open the Vidhan Sabha and Parliament to people? So, telecast of proceedings, making of information available, these are also issues that have been discussed. One issue that has dominated the theme for the presiding officers conferences, as Mr. Agnihotri was pointing out, is the proper functioning of the House, without disturbances. And I remember in the early 2000s, one of the recommendations from the conference was that there should be an automatic suspension of members if they come to the well of the House. And one of the changes that was brought about in the Lok Sabha rules of procedure did stem from a resolution from the presiding officers conference. The presiding officers conference also has been repeatedly talking about the accountability of the executive to the legislature. So, they have made recommendations there also. To me, I think the presiding officers forum offers two kinds of things. It offers that plenary session where the Lok Sabha speaker and this year the president would also lay down that broad mandate about how presiding officers should be thinking about their institutions. But it also offers that opportunity for presiding officers from across the country to exchange ideas, exchange notes about the functioning of their legislatures. And that becomes important this year in time of COVID about how different legislatures have coped up in discharging their constitutional duties.
Right. Chakshu, are you... Okay, it seems like we've lost the connection there with Chakshu. We'll try and reconnect with him and take the discussion forward. But right now, Yogendra Narayan, former Secretary General of the Rajya Sabha, joins us on the phone line right now. So, Mr. Narayan, let's talk about and let's understand the significance of the 80th All India Presiding Officers Conference.
You see, it is an attempt every year to coordinate the functioning of the parliament with the state legislatures. All over the country, we have these state legislatures, and they are more or less, their procedures are getting in tune with that of the central parliament. So this gives us an opportunity to know the issues being faced in the state legislatures and the issues being faced and tackled in the parliament, and how they can learn from the best practices of both. And this has been a very useful forum. You see, apart from this national forum of state legislatures and the central parliament, Parliament also participates in two other international conferences. And the reason why I'm highlighting is that the best practices amongst the countries abroad, in parliaments abroad, are also transmitted through the parliament to the state legislatures. For example, we have the International Parliamentary Union, where all the parliaments of the entire world, wherever the parliaments are, they meet in Geneva or any other place. Then we have the Commonwealth Parliamentary Union. So, where Indian Parliament participates and with its delegates. So, a lot of international practices are also transmitted through these conferences to the state legislature. That's one point. The second point is that these conferences, where the speaker presides and the Secretary General of the Lok Sabha is the Secretary of the conference, it helps the state legislatures and the parliament to coordinate and unite on certain issues. I remember when Mr. Somnath Chatterjee called a special meeting of the parliament and the state legislatures to decide on how they would face the notices being received from the Supreme Court. See, at the time, Parliament had expelled certain members, and these members had gone to the Supreme Court. Now, we were advised by our Speaker that and by our Chairman, that is the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha, not to reply to these notices of the Supreme Court, since we didn't recognize the power of the Supreme Court to send us notices, because we were independent and autonomous. So this issue was raised by the Speaker and was decided unitedly with the state legislatures that in such cases we should not respond to the notices, because we don't accept the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court on our legislatures. Eventually, of course, what happened is we didn't reply, and we just advised the law department to inform the Supreme Court about the existing legal and constitutional position of the legislatures. Eventually, of course, the Supreme Court upheld the expulsion of the members on the ground that they considered that everything had been fair and reasonable. The members had been given adequate opportunity, and so they didn't intervene. So sometimes it helps us to get united on certain issues. Apart from that, there are lots of issues which I'm sure Mr. Vivek Agnihotri would have mentioned, that new ideas keep on getting initiated from Parliament, and then they get broadened in the state legislatures, and we also participate. Like as Secretary Generals, we used to participate in regional conferences of the parliaments, of the state legislatures. For example, I remember going to the Northeast, and all the legislatures and the speakers and the prominent members of each legislature were asked to come and participate in the discussions. So our going there also helps us in understanding the problems of the state legislatures in the Northeast. I found it very useful. And when I spoke to our chairman, he said we should raise this issue on a common national forum also, the issues raised. Further, this opportunity, this conference gives us an opportunity for the Secretary Generals to meet and deliberate and consider and recommend on certain issues. So, I remember we discussed ensuring ethical conduct in the Indian Parliament, recent changes in electoral laws, effective capacity building programs for parliamentarians, evaluating Parliament, objective methods, and this this interaction between the Secretary Generals, which is a part of the Presiding Officers Conference, but held separately within the forum of the Secretary Generals and the Secretaries of the State Legislatures.
Right.
So that the Secretariat therefore gets adequate feedback as to what is happening in the other legislatures, and then we try to sort out the issues, and then we expect the Secretaries of the State Legislatures to advise their presiding officers accordingly of the deliberations and recommendations made by the Secretary Generals and the Secretaries of State Legislatures. So
Absolutely.
this is one forum which we find very useful on various counts. And since it's been going on since 1921, this meeting of the National Conference of the state and the Parliament has been going on since 1921. That is when it was first held. And so it has developed its own conventions and procedures. And this conference, as you all know, there's no voting in this. Only resolutions are passed.
Right.
And then they are sent for consideration to the various speakers and the chairman, etc., for consideration and adoption. So I think it's a very useful forum, and it should continue. And we hope it will come out with solutions which are now plaguing the working of the legislatures, both at the state and central level. Especially this practice of training of legislators, which has emerged as a very, prominent prominent issue in the various meeting of the presiding officers, has highlighted this. So that's my take on this. Thank you.
Mr. Narayan, since we are here, let's talk about another aspect as well. You're just building on what you have already spoken about. You yourself mentioned about how we are in the centenary year as far as the conference is concerned. This is the 80th All India Presiding Officers Conference. So over the years, how has the conference kept pace with the changing times?
The issues taken up in these Presiding Officers Conference are the issues relevant at the time when the conference is held. So it has been evolving because we do not discuss very outdated issues or issues which have been discussed at length earlier. We take the problems which Parliament or the legislature is facing today, and then we, for example, I would like to mention again ethical conduct of the members. Where the quiz was formed for the first time by Rajya Sabha, wasn't that the ethics problems which had been raised over in the media for the attention of the state legislature. Now, state legislature. Then the question of training, which I just mentioned, because the public was saying that these the legislators who come here are fresh; they do not know what work to do. So these issues come up. Then there was this question of anti-defection law. This question of anti-defection law that has come up and in a way restrained the working of the legislators because you are bound down by the party whip. So whether this needs an change. Similarly, whether the concept of offices of profit, that became a relevant issue when a lot of members were expelled between 2002 to 2007 on the basis of office of profit. So what I find is that the presiding officers take up issues which are relevant to the times of today. And therefore, I find it very relevant that it is evolving in a very set way in sorting out issues which have been raised in the public, either in the media or otherwise, and then trying to find out problems to these issues. Thank you.
Right. Right. Okay. Mr. Narayan, do stay with us. I'll come back to you for another reaction, of course, ahead in the program. Let me go across to the other two panelists as well who've been patiently listening in on everything that's been going on. So, Chakshu, let me come back to you. As far as the 80th conference is concerned, what's on the agenda over today and tomorrow?
Frank, I think there are two or three different things that are there on the agenda. As you rightly mentioned, the overall theme of the conference is harmonious relationship between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So that's an overall theme. Then, in the conference last year in Dehradun, certain committees were formed. So, for example, Mr. Narayan was referring to the anti-defection law. One of the committee that was formed was under the chairmanship of the Speaker of Rajasthan Vidhan Sabha on the role of speakers in respect of the anti-defection law. So the three committees that were formed during the 2019 Dehradun conference, I think some of those committees will be presenting the reports, and there's going to be a discussion on those reports. Then I think the conference might also discuss an ongoing theme, which is the harmonization between the legislative procedure between the different legislative assemblies across the country. One aspect of the 2019 conference was how do you ensure the budgetary independence of legislative secretariats? So there might be some discussion on that also. But I think on the sidelines of the conference, when presiding officers get an opportunity to interact with each other, they might also want to discuss issues around smooth functioning of the House. How will House functioning evolve? For example, parliamentary functioning, underwent a little bit of change during the monsoon session. The state presiding officers would want to understand from our speaker as to what are some of those things and what are some of those considerations that went into the Parliament Secretariat's mind when they were shifting some of the processes for Parliament. So I think it's going to be a packed agenda for presiding officers, where not only will they be sitting and listening into plenary sessions to the President, to the Vice President, and to the Speaker, and then the Prime Minister, but there's going to be smaller discussions within the conference between themselves on a range of issues.
Mr. Narayan, let me come back to you again for another reaction on this, on the theme of this year's conference. Let's dwell upon that. Harmonious coordination between legislature, executive, and judiciary. Your thoughts?
The judiciary at the highest level has consciously adopted this policy of not intervening in the internal working of Parliament. And I just mentioned to you about this when we expelled the members, when the Speaker expelled members who under the, when they were alleged to have taken money for asking questions and others. The Supreme Court, first of all, heard the members, but at the end of the day, we agree with what Parliament has done. So, at the highest level, I find there's an attempt at harmony by the courts also to intervene. Now, as far as the non-legislative function of the Speaker or the Chairman is concerned, for example, action against the Secretariat staff or something, that of course comes under the purview of the judiciary also, because the question of taking action or suspending some officer or removing him themselves would come within the domain of the judiciary. The third question, which is actually the most prominent when the judiciary intervenes, is, for example, I found that on the matters of privilege, Parliament consciously has not made law on privileges. It is undefined. And the only change that was made is that when originally the provision of privileges was mentioned in the Constitution, it just said the privileges will be the same as that of the British House of Commons. Now, in '76, it was amended to say that they removed the word British House of Commons, etc., and they just said the privileges will remain same as they were existing when Parliament was constituted. So the question is, privileges has been undefined, and the challenge that often happens as far as the judiciary is concerned as to what is the matter of privilege. And you see, recently in that case of Maharashtra, when a prominent TV personality went to the Supreme Court against the action of the state legislature of Maharashtra, the state legislature promptly issued a notice of breach of privilege, and the Supreme Court has taken umbrage on this and asked this, the secretariat official who issued that notice to explain why they should not treat it as contempt. So this is one area where I find there's a blurring of jurisdictions. Though breach of privilege is a matter which is a power inherent in the legislature, but the Supreme Court take notice of this when it affects the individual freedom of, let us say, an editor or a guild, etc., or a newspaper or a journalist. They do tend to intervene. Now that becomes a very sensitive issue between the legislature and. So I think, but at the end of the day, I find there's a complete harmony with the judiciary, because the highest level also understands that it should not go too far. When we had the strong speaker strategy, he frankly refused to even acknowledge the notice or even reply to that notice issued by Supreme Court. He took a stand that, look, the jurisdictions are well defined. You can't intervene in our jurisdiction. So I think it's a question of becoming aware at the highest level of and having mutual respect for these institutions that finally ensures that there is harmonious working between the judiciary and the legislature. Cases of course have happened, like UP, when the Supreme Court intervened between two people who claimed to be chief ministers. Then the Supreme Court intervened and said, okay, the sitting will be held with both these candidates sitting on the speaker's dais,
Right.
and the voting will take place. So there it intervened, and nobody objected, because it was in the larger interest of the legislature also to know who is the chief minister.
Mr. Narayan, let me just interrupt you for a second there, because, we've got live visuals on our screens right now. Let me just update our viewers about what's happening as well. President Ramnath Kovind has arrived in Kevadia, and he will be proceeding to the venue of the conference, which is to be held in very, very close to the Statue of Unity as well. And like Chakshu was pointing out earlier in the program, it's very important to note the place where the conference is taking place this time around as well. Let's not forget that this is the 80th Speakers Conference, or Conference of Presiding Officers, and it is in its centenary year. It's been going on for 100 years now, and some critical decisions have been taken at the conference, and the presiding officers have taken away a lot really as far as this conference is concerned. And those were the visuals that we're getting you from Kevadia of the president arriving there, and he's slated to inaugurate and launch the 80th edition of this particular conference at around 11:15 a.m., which is about a little over 30 minutes from now. Chakshu, coming back to you now, let's go back to the point that you were making earlier in the program as well, the importance of the venue itself.
Frank, I think, as I mentioned, the conference was limited to Delhi and Shimla in the pre-independence period. It was Speaker Mavlankar who suggested that the conference should travel all over the country. And one of the conventions that evolved was that different states and their legislatures would host or play the role of a host when the conference came to that state. And states were playing that role, in turn. Earlier, there were some occasions where the conference would go outside of the capital city, but now, because of the logistics involved in holding a conference of this magnitude, with so many presiding officers and secretary generals coming, now it is usually limited to the capital cities of states. I think after some time, and probably Agnihotri ji can correct me. He's had a much longer experience in this. I think after a very long time, the conference has moved out of a state capital city and to a venue which is outside of a legislature. The other part that I wanted to stress upon was the reason I thought the venue was a little more symbolic was because of Vithalbhai Patel. Vithalbhai Patel, many people say, laid down the foundation of the independence of legislature from the executive. He became the first elected president of the Central Legislative Assembly when the executive was way more dominant, when the colonial executive was way more dominant. And I was reading up his biography, and one of the things that is mentioned in his biography is that one of the first things that he did was the simple act of the viceroy, coming to Parliament House and the speaker having to vacate his chair so that the viceroy could address the Central Legislative Assembly from there. He put a stop to that. He said that the president of the Central Legislative Assembly vacating his chair for the executive sends a wrong signal, and that is one of the foundation stones of the independence of the legislature that Vithalbhai Patel set. And to honor that first elected speaker or presiding officer of the Central Legislative Assembly, if you see visuals of Lok Sabha, you would notice that his portrait hangs right opposite. So from the speaker's chair. So from the speaker's chair, every presiding officer of Lok Sabha is able to see Vithalbhai Patel and understand as to what the role of the legislature is. I'll also give one, final instance about how Vithalbhai Patel kind of embodied the fact that when he became the presiding officer, he did not belong to any political party. There's a letter mentioned in his biography which mentions that he used to send his salary as speaker to Mahatma Gandhi. And before his election to the post of the president, he was a member of the Swaraj Party, and it was suggested that he should contribute his salary towards party funds. And Vithalbhai Patel was of the view that contributing his salary to the political party would indicate that he was still associated with his party, and that would not be a fair thing for him to do as a presiding officer. So he sent his salary to Mahatma Gandhi to be used for national purposes. So these are little things, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, in his when he chaired the President's Conference for the first time, the conference passed a motion for an independent secretariat for the Central Legislative Assembly, which then laid the foundation for an independent secretariat for Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Agnihotri, going back to a point that you were making earlier as well, and we were dwelling upon the theme too, you gave the analogy of the three-legged chair and very beautifully explained why all three organs are so important and why it is important for them to work together, that is the legislature, executive and judiciary. How do we bring about more synergy between the three?
Well, ultimately, all these three bodies are autonomous. And on the face of it, we also have this doctrine of separation of powers. But unlike the presidential system in USA, where this separation of powers is really very well defined and can be practiced very easily. In a democracy like India, which is on this Westminster model, where willy-nilly the executive and legislature are like twins. And one of the authors has described they are twins, identical twins, joined at the head and the hip and the legs. That means because the members of the legislature are the ministers of the executive, and therefore it is very difficult to separate them. And if by chance the executive and the legislature combine, then the imbalance between the three legs of the democracy or three pillars of democracy starts. So, therefore, it is important to respect this autonomy of the other organ of the government for each of the three. Because if it does not come about, then you will have situations which have arisen in the past when the executive has tried to browbeat and sort of the judiciary, and then there have been repercussions, and then a lot of bad blood has been created and suspicion and all that. So the best way to keep this harmony together is for each of these organs to respect the autonomy of the other, apart from trying to assert one's own autonomy.
Mr. Narayan, since we are here, that's as far as the three bodies go. Let's talk about strengthening parliamentary democracy itself. How can we use some of the available parliamentary devices and, work on capacity building to strengthen parliamentary democracy as a whole?
Strengthening of parliamentary democracy will depend on three factors. One is respect for the legislator. Second is the respect which the executive should have. And the third is a harmonious relation, as Vivek mentioned, between all the three. Now, let me come to the legislator first. Today, a legislator feels that as soon as he becomes an MLA or MP, he moves away from the common public and he becomes sort of a part of the official machinery, and he asserts his authority and his power. And then he doesn't even visit his constituency even twice or thrice in the entire 5 years. Secondly, earlier it was also that the legislature was less educated than the the educated elite who form the opinion in the country, whether it's the media or the. So then third was this anti-defection law, which makes the legislature think more about protecting or himself by following entirely the mandate and dictate of the party, even in constituency matters. Because if, for example, his members of constituency feel strongly about a certain issue, he has to kowtow the line of the party. I think this anti-defection law has also weakened the legislature and in a way weakened parliamentary democracy. So as far as the legislature is concerned, we should see that he is well educated, has a good reputation. Supreme Court and the Election Commission have now laid down that if there are criminal cases against the legislature, it has to be published in the press. It's not being fully done. They have to explain reasons why a criminal who is chosen to be fighting election, why is he being chosen over others, etc. So the first thing I would say to improve, to strengthen parliamentary democracy is improve the image and capacity of the legislature itself. Secondly, to improve parliamentary democracy, the executive must understand that they are responsible to the legislature. They're not above it. And though the legislature is mandated not to interfere in the day-to-day working of the executive, but as far as policy matters are concerned, it can influence policy, but not day-to-day work. But we find that the executive and the individual legislator often come in conflict because they try to intervene in the functioning of the executive at the field level. To strengthen parliamentary democracy, it is necessary for the legislator to understand his position and for the executive to understand their position. So, if the legislator knows that he is only there to discuss in parliament policy issues and not, influence local government decisions, then parliamentary democracy can also be strengthened. Third, the institutional failure in the constitutional authorities should be stopped, should be prevented. Judiciary is now being accused of favoring the government. Somehow that image has been created by vested interests or even otherwise by the press and others, that the judiciary tends to follow the executive dictates more. That image should not exist at all. And secondly, the legislature must also understand, like for example, recently Chief Minister of a state commented on the position of a Supreme Court judge, accusing him of bias and acting against the authority, executive, cabinet, and authority of that state. Now, these sort of allegations, when they are made, they tend to undermine the institutions which exist. So, this harmonious relationship between the three is or has also to be protected, and they can be best protected by public opinion and best protected by these three organizations themselves. Because, as Vivek said, they are autonomous in their own way, and there's nobody else above them who can coordinate. Because there is no higher constitutional authorities than these three authorities. So they must understand their role they are playing, the importance they have. And that's how parliamentary democracy strengthens, in my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, right. So, Chakshu, since we are talking about strengthening of parliamentary democracy, let's talk about the role of the presiding officers as well and how they can enable this.
Frank, one of the things which has been a theme at the presiding officers has been a discussion on the role of the presiding officer. Now, while the presiding officer is called the speaker for the lower house, his role is to speak less and to actually facilitate more debate within members. And for that, the speaker's hands need to be empowered. So over the years, the conference has decided on a number of things to strengthen the hand of presiding officers. Let me take 2 or 3 examples. One example has been how do presiding officers ensure that the constitutional role of a legislature to scrutinize government proposals in detail or to scrutinize government of policy in detail can be given effect to. And one of the discussions, as far back as the 1970s, was on the formation of a committee system in Parliament. So the presiding officers conference discussed as to what should be the contours of an effective committee system, how should that committee system work, and slowly Parliament started adopting that committee system, a full-fledged committee system. Where departmentally related standing committees came about in the early 90s. So that's one way in which the presiding officers conference has discussed the role for presiding officers and also contributed to strengthening the institution of the legislature. One of the things that we have now discussed a few times is the anti-defection law. Now, the conversation around anti-defection law or legislators shifting parties did not start happening in the presiding officers conference after the constitutional amendment of 1985. That conversation actually started in the mid 60s, when instances of legislators shifting parties at the state level became quite rampant. I remember there was a resolution passed in the 1960, I think 1967 or 68, with regard to defection by legislators. Now, the phenomena of defection has cropped up as part of debate on multiple occasions. In 1992, the anti-defection law was discussed because during that time, the Supreme Court had passed a judgment that the court would be able to review the decisions of presiding officers when it came to anti-defection cases. Then, during the late 90s, when there were a number of coalition governments that were getting formed, the question of anti-defection law again came up. And one of the things that was discussed there was the provision related to splits that was there in the defection law. Consequent to these discussions, a constitutional amendment bill was passed in 2002, which removed the provision of splits from the anti-defection law. Now, in the last conference, a committee was appointed under the chairmanship of the Rajasthan Speaker, Dr. C.P. Joshi, to examine as to how to ensure that the office of the presiding officer is protected when they are intervening in cases related to anti-defection law. Because one of the first things that happens whenever defection proceedings are started is the office of the speaker, allegations are cast against the office of the speaker. The office of the speaker is involved in judicial proceedings, as has been seen in a number of cases. And then that invites intervention from the courts about who should stay in office, who should not stay in office. There have also been instances where courts have gone ahead and given orders about conduct of proceedings about confidence motions on the floor of the House. They have prescribed on which day should those proceedings be held, and usually something which is the prerogative of the presiding officer, which is declaring the result of a no confidence motion or a vote on the floor of the House. The judiciary has asked for those votes to be brought in a sealed cover to the court for the court to then declare as to what the result is. So I think I keep coming back to the presiding officers conference, and the reason I do that is every state legislature faces a variation of issues emanating from its own rules of functioning, emanating from the functioning of the executive, emanating from the functioning of its own members. And what should they be learning from each other, or where are the places where they should be uniting or building a consensus about what should be the way forward? So it's a great forum for that.
Right. So, Mr. Agnihotri, since we're talking about, sub-themes, let's talk about another very important aspect as well. So how do we ensure that the workings of the legislature are not hindered due to ruckus or disruption? This is something that is of immense importance as well.
Well, as has been said earlier also, see, there is no authority above the parliament to sort of negotiate these issues or to decide about the conduct of the House. And therefore, self-discipline, that is the only way in which this situation can move forward. Of course, as Chakshu Roy mentioned, Mr. Somnath Chatterjee, following from the recommendations of one of the presiding officers' conference, introduced a special rule in the rules of procedure of the conduct of the Lok Sabha, that as soon as the members, any member comes to the well of the House, he will automatically be suspended from the House. Because normally the rule says that after the presiding officer has named a member, then a few things follow. He is suspended immediately, or he is suspended for a few days, or whatever. But if a person comes to the house, to the well, then the presiding officer doesn't have to exercise his discretion, because the rule itself says the moment the member comes to the well of the house, he will stand suspended. But that is not the end of the story, because if there is a single member or a few members coming to the well of the house, then of course this rule can be easily adopted. But if a whole opposition rushes to the well of the house, then it is not in the interest of the proceedings of the house itself to expel or to suspend the entire opposition. And therefore, there is a need for evolving some other ways of doing the business of the house, while some members may be disturbing the proceedings of the house. And that is where, in the recently concluded monsoon session of the Rajya Sabha, there was this decision of the presiding officer that the bill will be taken up for consideration and passing while the house was in a disturbed condition. Now, taking a vote of the members for the passage of a bill when the disturbance is going on is an issue which needs to be debated and discussed and decided, because the presiding officer may keep on telling the members that they should go back to their seats in order for the house to come to order and the presiding officer to be able to take the vote of the house on the bill or any other resolution that may be before the house. And therefore, it is very important that some rule is framed in this regard, so that the presiding officer is not blamed for doing certain things to favor the ruling party and the treasury benches as against the opposition. So this is one aspect that I think will engage the attention of the present presiding officers conference, and they may have to come to some understanding as to how to conduct the business of the house while the house is not in order.
Absolutely. So, Narayan, let's talk about another aspect, the use of information technology. And that is even more important now as a result of the pandemic and everything that we are getting used to. We are all getting used to a new normal. So the role of information technology, is extremely important and crucial going forward. So how can we use IT to carry out proceedings seamlessly?
One thing I would like to mention here is that right from 2002, at least I remember, we have been using information technology as far as circulating the rules of the business for the day is concerned, the agenda for the day is concerned, and also sending information to the members of parliament. Also, IT has been used to list out all the individual members, what questions he asked, how many questions he asked, etc. That is on the functioning of the parliamentarians. Now, as far as the pandemic is concerned, today, the situation as it faced today, in the present case, when the sessions were held, the presiding officers decided that they will do it on alternate days, and they will hold the session in a way that lower members hold the session one day, and then later, subsequently, even the same day or the next day, the other house would hold it. But the fact is that to use information technology for holding sessions where the members of parliament remain in their house, that is not possible. And it should not be attempted at all. I feel that IT can be used for as far as business of the house is concerned, But if a session has to take place, all that we can do is that we can use IT technology to send the business of the day, or any questions that are asked to be come from through the IT mechanism. But if you want to hold sessions during the pandemic, the whole fact is that the participation and the presence of the members of parliament is necessary. And because otherwise you cannot have debates or questions being asked at the question hour, during the question hour, and all this. So I would say that leaving aside the sessions of the houses, in all other aspects, information technology can play a very, very big role. And it is playing, and gradually both the houses, I find, are gradually evolving into sort of paperless administration and paperless interaction with the parliamentarians and the legislators. So this is the way we are going ahead, and it has to be done gradually. And please remember that pandemic, of course, has brought out of the box solutions in many areas, but there are certain areas which still remain, which cannot be done on a sort of webinar or WebEx means of meetings. They need personal presence. So to sum up, what I would say is IT is playing a big role in the working of the secretariats of the parliament. New methods can be found to improve that working. As far as sessions are concerned, I would still consider that IT can only be should not be utilized as far as individual participation of the house in the sessions is concerned. That's all I would like to say.
Right. Okay. Chakshu Roy, going back to a point that was being made earlier about discipline and disruption, it has featured prominently in previous conferences in the past as well, likely to feature in this particular conference as well. So, as far as this particular aspect is concerned, I think a law is also being mooted, or, the people are trying to figure out how exactly we can bring about more discipline and less disruption.
Frank, I think, in the last 1 hour that we've been having this discussion on the Presiding Officers Conference, a couple of very interesting points have come about. And one of the things that Mr. Agnihotri said was about self-discipline. A legislator is the highest lawmaker in the country or, in their respective state. Now, to ensure discipline and decorum in the House, yes, there definitely can be rules that can be evolved. But at the end of the day, those rules come at a cost. So, for example, if there is one indisciplined legislator, possibly the rule can be used. But, if there are a large number of them, then the presiding officer is put in a quandary, because disciplining them would also then mean that he or she would be limiting the participation of members in the debate. So that's one aspect to think about. I think over the years, whenever the Presiding Officers Conference has thought about the issue of discipline and decorum and debate in Parliament, it has thought about in two areas. One is, what is it that you can do to strengthen the rules? And what is it that you can do to incentivize more debate in Parliament? So, for example, on a number of occasions, the Presiding Officers Conference has suggested that for larger legislatures, there should be at least a minimum 100 days of sitting. The idea being, when the legislatures sit for a longer duration of time, every legislator will have the time to air their grievances, put forth the views of their party or views of their people in front of their colleagues and draw attention to them. So whenever there is more opportunity for them to highlight issues, then the chances of disruptions are reduced. That's one. The second part that they've also talked about is I was reading one of the summaries of presiding officers conference where it was suggested that possibly there could be something done about reserving specific time in a week's business so that individual members issues can be raised. So I think the idea emanates from the House of Commons, where one day is reserved for opposition to only discuss their issues. So this is another thing that has been taken up in the presiding officers conference. Coming to the point of technology, and I'll just take half a minute and then yield to Agnihotri Saab for his views on this. To me, I think technology is an enabler. Parliament, had a teleprinter in the 1950s so that MPs could get information about latest events when they were going to participate in House debates. What is it that can be used? What is the best of technology that can be used to ensure that parliamentary effectiveness, parliamentary participation, meetings of Parliament can be facilitated? All those options should definitely be explored.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Agnihotri, your thoughts on technology?
Well, I would begin with what is now going to begin. And that is, as you are aware, a new Parliament House is on its way. And a part of this new Parliament House complex is a facility which provides accommodation to all the members of Parliament for their offices. Now, office is only the physical infrastructure. You need to have to add to it the intellectual infrastructure. And that is by providing the members of Parliament with the services of requisite personnel who will help them in capacity building. Now, this is not something new. It is there in US and other countries where members are provided with the assistance of experts, etc., or personnel to help them in improving their capacities. In India, in our parliament, etc., it is only the library to which the members approach, and then the personnel in the library, to the extent possible, is able to provide them with all the material on a particular issue. But still, the member or his assistant has to go there and get that service. The person whom the MP today engages is most of the time not a person who can directly assist him in these matters. So there has to be a professional service, and there is one. The library service is there, but it has to be enlarged so that adequate number of people are recruited for the purpose to put and provide assistance to the members of Parliament so that they are able to do their homework properly before they come to the House. Because if they have done the homework properly, then they will be able to participate and contribute to the proceedings of the House in a much better fashion. Technology, of course, will help in this regard, but technology, as Dr. Yogendra said, has its own limitations, because ultimately the dynamics of a house functioning cannot be replicated through use of video conferencing, etc. And the whole charm of a parliament proceedings cannot be really created by using technology. So that will have to be there. But so long as there are problems, and I hope they will not continue, but even during this part, perhaps the proceedings of the House could have been provided option to the members and to the political parties as to who will attend the parliament proceedings in person and who will attend it through video conferencing mode, so that everybody is connected, some by sitting in the House and others by through video conferencing. But that would have required perhaps some alteration in the technology that is currently available to the two houses of Parliament and elsewhere. So upgradation of technology will be needed in order to ensure that when such a situation arises, the Parliament is not deprived of the contribution of the members who are as I have said, empowered and sort of provided better support through their technical staff.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Narayan, let's talk about what more innovations that we can bring in.
Innovations in rules and procedures, are you?
In rules and procedures generally as a whole to strengthen, parliamentary democracy as a whole and make it more vibrant.
Well, the changes that are required internally within Parliament are within the realm of Parliament itself. That's the rules of business, rules of procedure of the houses. Now, in that committee, I think in which Mr. Vivek Agnihotri was also there, was set up to suggest ways to improve the internal functioning of Parliament and the procedures which needed changes. So I won't go into it because, as was mentioned, the legislators, elected legislators are supreme by themselves and they make their own rules of business and procedure. And there's no way, and there should not be a way where the executive intervenes or the judiciary intervenes in the rules of procedure and business. Now, we attempted one thing in the past, and that was when we started televising the proceedings. We thought that once the televising starts, members would be better behaved and would be speaking more responsibly and would not be creating, ruptures and disruptors in the house. But that happened the reverse. That when the television started, the legislators to draw attention of their constituency and members of the public started misbehaving, started shouting, trying to attract the attention of the public through the TV. So that didn't work out very well in improving the working of Parliament. Now, to improve the working of Parliament, self-regulation, as has been mentioned, is the only way. And the self-regulation can come in two ways. One is by the members themselves, and the other is by the public, the media. If the media continues and to highlight the behavior or the misbehavior of parliamentarians within Parliament, and also draws parallels between what is happening here and what is happening in the world outside, it helps in self-regulation. And if the public also makes an outcry against such behavior of legislators, it can improve the functioning of the both the state and central legislatures. But ultimately, it is self-regulation, and all the rules and procedures you might keep on changing, but this does not help very much. The third way is, if the presiding officers can carry more weight, can carry more respect by removing the party labels from themselves and taking very independent decisions, which are not only independent in the working, but also appear to be independent. If the speaker, if the chair of both the houses can earn that respect, I think it will go a long way in improving the working, because otherwise the members of the parliament feel that, oh, he's favoring this party, he's favoring that party, etc. So the crux is the presiding officer as far as within Parliament is concerned, and the crux is media and public reaction against misbehavior of the parliamentarians on TV or press. I think these ways you can, make the functioning of Parliament stronger and more effective. That's my take on this. Thank you.
Right. Chakshu, let's talk about another aspect as well. How do we ensure better coordination between the state assemblies and Parliament and vice versa?
Frank, I think this is a role that is championed by the Parliament Secretariat quite effectively. When you go through the different functioning of the Parliament Secretariat, one of the things that the Bureau for Parliamentary Studies does regularly is that it holds trainings and seminars for secretariat officers from the various state legislatures. So that is one effective mechanism for building that better coordination, building that knowledge base of parliament and legislatures across the country. That's one part. The second part is, in addition to the presiding officers conference, there are conferences which are held in parliament. So, for example, in the recent past, there has been a women legislators conference that has been held. One conference that is held quite regularly, and I think is an equally important conference, is the conference of the chairmen of public accounts committees from across the country, where they all come to parliament and they discuss as to how to keep government accounts more scrutinized. So that's another area in which I think Parliament Secretariat is doing a lot of work. Now, in terms of how do you ensure that the institution of Parliament becomes central to debate in society, I think there are more innovative ways in which we can think about it. So, for example, in my personal opinion, I think Parliament comes into focus when the 3 sessions of Parliament take place. So, if Parliament sat for a longer time, discussion about the institution of legislature would be that much more, and that's a small part of it. I think there's another aspect of our parliamentary functioning that we should think about, which is how do citizens engage with the functioning of our legislatures? What is the access to citizens have to parliamentary proceedings? Earlier in the discussion, one of the things that was being talked about was televising of parliamentary proceedings has opened up Parliament to every citizen, and this televising happened in a graded fashion. I remember in the earlier 90s, first the question hour was telecast on Doordarshan after one day. Then there was telecast of the president's address, and then slowly we moved on to a full telecast of parliamentary proceedings. Now, while parliamentary proceedings are telecast completely, not the proceedings of all state legislatures are not telecast live. There are still a number of state legislatures where their proceedings are not available on a television channel or on cable TV. So that's another area that we need to think about. Second, it's not only about televising of proceedings. I remember from my time when I was in school and I used to read my civics book, there was not enough information about the role of the legislature. I think all that we read was that the number of MPs in Lok Sabha, the number of MPs in Rajya Sabha, the vice president is the chairman of Rajya Sabha, something about nominated members. I think we need to strengthen our curriculum when it comes to the institution of legislatures, so that when we have young people coming up for voting age, they can better understand the importance of a legislative institution. They can understand as to how does the legislative institution contribute to the democratic ethos of the country. Because in my opinion, the institution of legislature is a little distant. The state machinery is quite evident. There are government offices, there are government buildings. You see vehicles with government labels moving around. So the executive is much more closer to the citizen. And now we should also think about how do you bring the legislature closer to the citizen. And different countries around the world have experimented in different ways on how to do it. Can there be ways of opening up Vidhan Sabhas and Parliament to common citizens? In certain
Yeah, we seem to have lost the line there with
the
Chakshu.
government,
Okay, we can hear you. Chakshu, go ahead. Yeah, very quickly. Let me get closing comments from the
Frank, I
other
was just
panelists as
saying
well.
that in certain states, the governor opens up the Raj Bhavan on Independence Day or Republic Day for public exhibitions. Right? In the past, Parliament has held exhibitions around themes around Constitution or other areas. When Parliament is not in session, when we have a new Parliament building, how can we reimagine the engagement of common citizens with the institution of Parliament? So that's a thing that we should also think about.
Absolutely. These are live visuals that you're getting on your screens right now from Kevadia. We are just a couple of minutes away from the start of the 80th All India Presiding Officers Conference. Let's not forget, it's in its centenary year. The President will address the gathering, and it is scheduled to start in just a couple of minutes from now. All the dignitaries have arrived and have taken their seats. Let's not forget that we are in the midst of a pandemic, so all COVID appropriate behavior is being absorbed, and everyone is ensuring that they are doing their bit as far as the pandemic is concerned as well. And these are live visuals that you're seeing right now from Kevadia. Okay, 2 minutes to go. Before I wind up the preview, of course, let me get closing comments in from all the panelists. Mr. Narayan, coming to you first, very quickly. What can we expect?
I would expect a very vibrant discussion because the agenda has been fixed and the speakers are all participating. And there will be some resolutions passed. Now it is on the speakers and the presiding officers to implement those resolutions. And a lot of onus will be on the presiding officers to ensure that the resolutions are acted upon. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Mr. Agnihotri.
Well, I think the role of the speaker itself is, or the presiding officer itself, is an issue which needs to be sort of highlighted and discussed, and maybe discussed, because it is a very difficult and thankless job, because it is like a monitor of a class, because the presiding officer is one of them, I mean, except for the upper house, but he has to discipline his own colleagues. Moreover, which makes the thing more difficult, is the fact that he belongs to one of the parties, and still he has to rise above the party and not only do this, not only he should do this, but he should be seen as doing it. Because otherwise, whatever decision he takes will somehow look colored to the members of the opposition. And therefore, he has to develop a sort of what you call diplomatic skills and patience in order to be able to infuse this feeling in the other members that he is acting impartially. So I think the role of the speaker or the presiding officer itself may be discussed in these proceedings.
Absolutely. We'll continue the discussion in the lead up to the beginning of the launch of the event itself. We just saw visuals from within the conference hall. A short while from now, most of the dignitaries have taken their seats, and this particular event is scheduled to begin in a very short while from now. So continuing our discussion here in our studio, Chakshu, let me come across to you now. So, since we are talking about expectations, since we are talking about, what is it that is going to be of significance over the next 2 days, your thoughts?
Frank, I think there are two aspects to the conference. One is the formal proceedings, which will take place over the course of 2 days. And the other is the informal interactions between presiding officers and their officers from across the country. Many presiding officers have tenured, have experience of leading the work in their legislative institutions. Many presiding officers from states, this might be their first presiding officers conference. So this will be an opportunity for them to engage with other senior presiding officers and get their take about how to handle issues, how to run their houses smoothly. I think it will also be a forum for exchange of ideas. Certain presiding officers would be able to share developments about what they have been able to do to increase decorum, what they have been able to do to ensure that debate in the House is that much more in-depth and fruitful. So I think in addition to the formal part of the proceedings, I'm really looking forward to presiding officers and their teams, getting to engage with each other. Finally, the resolutions that come out of this presiding officers conference will also be extremely important. This conference is coming towards the end of the year, and it will lay down, the foundation for deliberative functioning over the next entire year. And I hope that some of the resolutions that come out of this conference are given serious thought and consideration by the respective state legislatures.
Just hold that thought, Chakshu. Let me just speak about the visuals that we see on our screens right now as well. This is the venue of the conference, which is in Kevadia, Gujarat, very close to the Statue of Unity. The dignitaries are arriving even as I speak. This is the chairman of the Rajya Sabha and Vice President of India, Mr. M. Venkaiah Naidu, arriving at the venue as well. The conference will begin with an address of the President. The Vice President is also then slated to speak at the conference after the President. There you have it, visuals on your screens right now, where the Vice President of India and Chairman of the Rajya Sabha has arrived at the venue, and all the other dignitaries are greeting him as well as he enters the venue and takes his place. We're still waiting, of course, the arrival of the President at the venue of the conference itself. The President arrived at Kevadia a short while ago, and he is slated to arrive at the venue shortly from now and begin the conference. Yeah, go ahead, Chakshu.
Yes, Frank, I think, I was talking about the informal aspects or the discussions that presiding officers will have with each other during breaks or when they are in smaller groups with each other. I think one of the things that Mr. Agnihotri has been talking about is that self-discipline. And, since we saw the Vice President on the screen, the Vice President's also been talking about a code of conduct for members. And this is something that he's been, he has stressed on a number of occasions as to can there be a code of conduct that can be evolved for legislators that could then help and aid in decorum in the House. So that's another aspect. I hope there are some discussions around that. I'm hoping that the theme around anti-defection law and insulating the office of presiding officers is also discussed. The last 3 years, we've seen multiple instances of anti-defection law leading to differences that arise and aspersions being cast on the presiding officers. So that is another key area I hope that gets discussed during the conference. And finally, the broader theme of the conference, which is that separation between judiciary, executive, and the legislature, and which Mr. Agnihotri beautifully pointed about, 3 legs of a chair. How do you ensure that they are on a platform without infringing upon the space of another? There have been numerous instances where the space of the legislature has been encroached upon when it comes to lawmaking or when it comes to other areas. So how do we ensure that discussions can take place about the separation of these 3 institutions as has been envisaged in our constitution?
Taking you through the visuals once again, the Vice President of India and the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha, Mr. M. Venkaiah Naidu, has arrived at the venue and has taken his seat. We are now waiting for the President to arrive at the venue, which is in Kevadia, Gujarat, to begin the 80th All India Presiding Officers Conference. So, Mr. Narayan, let me come across to you now. We're talking about, some of the other aspects apart from the theme itself, some key aspects that could come up really as far as this conference is concerned. It's also a great experience, isn't it, for, the officers of the the presiding officers of the state legislatures as well, just to be here and to so call this in and to participate in the conference as a whole?
As far as the presiding officers are concerned, it is their conference, and they should raise all the issues which are troubling them or which prevent the effective functioning of the state legislatures or of parliament. All these issues should be brought out. And I was really, while you were mentioning about the president and the vice president coming, I was thinking that in the address of the vice president or the president, whoever drafts the address for these dignitaries, and of course the additions and subtractions are made, additions are made by the both of them. They should highlight certain points in their speeches themselves, which is causing them concern. And these points in the speeches should be the first point of discussion amongst these presiding officers. So, if these speeches highlight,
Mr. Narayan, I'm sorry to cut you short, but we are all set to cut across live to Kevadia to begin the proceedings. So let's go across there.
For Parliamentary Affairs, Heavy Industries and Public Enterprises. Apart from the presiding officers, there are also senior staff members of the Secretariat, of the speakers of various assemblies, as well as of the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. And we can see that the organization is such that a safe distance is maintained, and all of them have taken every precaution, all wearing masks. And everybody who has come to this venue has also been tested and all found to be negative. So this is, in a sense, a bubble. The leader of the Congress Parliamentary Party in the Lok Sabha, Adar Ranjan Chaudhary. The dignitaries are awaiting the President of India, who is the head of Parliament, President Ramnath Kovind. This is Prahlad Joshi, the Minister for Parliamentary Affairs. Rajendra Trivedi, who is the Speaker of the Gujarat Vidhan Sabha.
1921 में अपनी स्थापना के बाद से दशकों से पीठासीन अधिकारियों का सम्मेलन एक जीवंत और प्रभावी मंच में विकसित हुआ है। भारत की विधानसभाओं की बदलती जरूरतों और संसदीय राजनीति के उभरते आयामों के साथ तालमेल बनाए रखना, ये उद्देश्य रहा पीठासीन अधिकारियों के सम्मेलन का। 1920 और 1930 के दशक में वापस शुरू करने के लिए सम्मेलन का उद्देश्य अनिवार्य रूप से भारत के साथ संसदीय प्रक्रियाओं के उचित समन्वय को सुरक्षित करना था, लेकिन विशेष रूप से स्वतंत्रता के बाद विधानमंडलों की शक्तियों और कार्यों में कई महत्वपूर्ण परिवर्तन हुए हैं और उसी के अनुरूप सम्मेलन के उद्देश्य, वस्तुएं और कार्यक्षेत्र भी व्यापक हुए हैं। आज ये सम्मेलन न केवल संसदीय प्रथाओं और प्रक्रियाओं से संबंधित मामलों पर चर्चा करने के लिए एक व्यापक मंच है, बल्कि हमारे संसदीय लोकतांत्रिक प्रणाली के लिए महत्व रखने वाले विभिन्न अन्य मुद्दों पर भी विचार विमर्श का एक मंच है।
As we said earlier, the theme of this year's conference is harmonious coordination between the legislature, executive and judiciary, which is a key to a vibrant democracy. And the presiding officers will be discussing the need for better cooperation and coordination between the three pillars of democracy in order to strengthen our country's democracy and to make it more effective and efficient. It's going to be discussing ways to ensure the constitutional accountability of the legislature and the executive to the people. As we were saying earlier, that people choose their representatives and they have great aspirations, and the people expect quite a lot from their representatives, and that trust has to be maintained, that accountability has to be maintained, and the people expect that constitutional accountability of the legislature and executive to the people of our country. That's what a democracy is. The conference will also discuss issues related to working of legislatures in a disciplined and orderly manner. President Sri Ramnath Kovind has arrived.
अस्सीवें अखिल भारतीय पीठासीन अधिकारियों के सम्मेलन के उद्घाटन के लिए राष्ट्रपति माननीय श्री रामनाथ कोविंद आयोजन स्थल पर पहुंच गए हैं। 2 दिवसीय ये सम्मेलन बेहद महत्वपूर्ण है। इस सम्मेलन का विषय विधायिका, न्यायपालिका और कार्यपालिका के बीच बेहतर समन्वय, एक मजबूत लोकतंत्र के लिए।
President Ramnath Kovind now entering the venue, which is Tent City 2, Narmada 2 in Kevadia. All members stand in respect and honor of the President of the country.